Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Chris Martin, and I am the Associate Director of the Davis Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. I want to thank you so much for joining us today for the third panel in our series, Decolonization in Focus. This series is now in its third year, having previously centered on the themes of race and intersectionality. The series has received generous sponsorship for the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, ACES, and from peer centers throughout the US. I would invite everyone who's joining us today to view all 6 panels, which have been scheduled throughout February and March. Each session in the series has been or will be live streamed and recorded for future reference in case you should miss any. Before we start, I do want to recognize today's grim anniversary and make clear that our hearts are with the military and civilian population of Ukraine today and every day. I also want to recognize my colleagues, Zsuzsanna Magdo from the University of Pittsburgh and Laura Sargent from the Davis Center, who have been instrumental in developing and executing this series. And I'd like to take a moment and thank our institutional sponsors, including our peer regional studies centers at the Universities of Chicago, Wisconsin-Madison, Kansas, Michigan, Texas at Austin, California, Berkeley, as well as Ohio State University, UNC Chapel Hill, Indiana University Bloomington, and George Washington University for their financial support of this series. And last, but of course not least, we have our gratitude to today's speakers who have answered our call and are stepping into this conversation, which is so critical to our field. Today's topic is emerging scholars on the state of the field, activism and advocacy. And it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's session, Dr. Jessica Pisano, who was instrumental in bringing together the young scholars from whom we will be hearing today. Jessica Pisano teaches politics at the New School for Social Research in New York City. She is a center associate at the Davis Center and a trustee of the Kharkiv Karazin University Foundation in Ukraine. Jessica is the author of Staging Democracy, Political Performance in Ukraine, Russia, and Beyond from Cornell University Press, 2022, which draws on long-term participant observation research to analyze theatrical political economies that sustain support for the Kremlin and change the meanings that attach to political participation. Her prize-winning book, The Post-Soviet Potemkin Village, Politics and Property Rights in the Black Earth, from Cambridge University Press, 2008, drew on research that she conducted in villages along the Ukraine-Russia border over the course of a decade. She's currently writing a history of property under fascism, state socialism, and neoliberal democracy on a single street in East Europe, between 1938 and 2014. She has a series of articles on Ukrainian and Russian politics and the American impeachment that have appeared in the Washington Post. And she's recently written on the timing of Russia's full-scale invasion in Politico and the artistry of Volodymyr Zelensky in the Journal of Democracy and Politics. She is the founding faculty director of the research group Decolonizing Eastern European Studies at the New School, which was founded in 2017, and all of today's speakers have been part of that group. So Jessica, thank you so much for shepherding today's conversation and bringing together such a dynamic group of young scholars.
Chris, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with all of you and to share in these conversations, both in the context of this seminar series and then in the broader field. Before we do our panel introductions for today, as Chris mentioned, it's fitting perhaps to reflect on the photo accompanying the website for this seminar series. And it's especially fitting to do so today, February 24th, the one-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale land invasion of Ukraine, a date that for many participating and listening divided life into before and after. Many of you will recognize the image on the webpage, a multi-story apartment building in Borodyanka, which was destroyed by Russian forces in early April 2022, and now is one of tens of thousands of such apartment buildings, people's homes, targeted by Russian missiles and shells across Ukraine. Across from the apartment building, we see a bust of Ukrainian national poet Taras Shevchenko, author of words known to every Ukrainian person, memorized by every Ukrainian child in school. І на обновленій землі врага не буде супостата, а буде син, і буде мати, і будуть люди на землі. As we look at this image, as Susan Sontag reminds us, what we see and how we see it is very much conditioned by where we stand. And so today we hope to contribute to this ongoing conversation about how to anchor knowledge reflexively and contextually, with attention to the power-laden processes that shape what we know, what we have forgotten, what has been erased, and what we choose to value and remember. So to introduce our panelists today, all three of whom are founding members of Decolonizing Eastern European Studies at the New School. We begin with Karolina Koziura, who is a PhD candidate in historical studies and sociology at the New School for Social Research. Her research investigates issues of nationalism, memory, and the politics of knowledge in and about Eastern Europe. So note the in and about. Her PhD dissertation traces the global processes of making Holodomor as informed by the Cold War era politics of knowledge production. Karolina has been a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, NYU's Jordan Center, and most recently at the Open Society Archives in Budapest. Her dissertation research has been supported by the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and Fulbright. And her research has been published widely already, among other places, in the European Journal of Sociology and East European Politics, Societies and Culture. And so we have Karolina, and next we will have Masha Shinkorenko, who recently defended her PhD in politics at the New School for Social Research. She is soon starting as a research associate at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and her work focuses broadly on questions of identity and resistance among Crimean Tatars in Crimea. And her published works likewise have appeared widely, both in academic journals such as Communist and Post-Communist Studies, and in online outlets such as the NYU Jordan Center blog, Democracy Seminar, Public Seminar, Eurasian, among others. And last but not least, we have Amanda Zadorian, who is visiting assistant professor of politics at Oberlin College in Ohio in the United States. She has previously taught at the Higher School for Economics in Moscow, and as well at the University Jana Amosken. I'm going to butcher the name because I didn't check Amanda's advice to me prior, in Prague, and at the New School for Social Research, where she received her PhD in 2018. Her work on authoritarian urbanism and state capitalism has been published in Geoforum and the International Journal of Public Administration, and she's currently completing a monograph about the global oil industry and financial rentier states in Russia and Brazil. So with that, we will turn it over to Karolina and discussion of her research. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be included in this important series of Decolonization in Focus. So thank you for the invitation. And of course, like many thanks to Jessica for organizing us from the DEES project today. I think that it's crucial to have this kind of one intellectual space that brings together diverse voices debating the meaning of decolonization, especially that in the past year or so, we witnessed the resurfacing of many ideas, very often conflicting through like various channels. Perhaps it is symbolic that the panel that includes emerging scholars is happening today, on February 24th, when so many of us mourn the past year, yet also feel very anxious and uncertain about what the future will bring. I would like to use my privilege of being an emerging scholar, and in my short presentation pose more questions that provide answers, and hopefully many other emerging voices will join us in conversation and share their perception of the field, its current political moment, and possible futures. So my reflection on the state of the field is going to be, to some extent, autobiographical. Partially, I follow the last panel on the perspectives outside and the perspectives on decolonization outside the Anglophone Academy, during which the presenters stress the importance of positionality in thinking about decolonization, and further critically analyze the scholarship produced in and about the region. However, my main goal is to show the importance of framing decolonization through knowledge production, or more precisely, the hierarchies of knowledge and power that have shaped the perception and the study of the region within American academia. Decolonial knowledge is a situated knowledge, and this particular one comes from a female scholar. I'm from Poland, and for more than 14 years, I have studied Ukrainian history and culture. I did my graduate degrees in Poznań, in Poland, and at CEU when I was still in Budapest. I have also studied in Ukraine. I conducted several ethnographic projects, mostly in Western and Southern Ukraine. And my doctoral dissertation that I'm currently completing at the New School for Social Research is a historical sociological study of the 20th century long political contest over the recognition of the famine in Ukraine, known today as the Holodomor. And I will talk about my research a bit later. So in the first panel of the Decolonization in Focus, Professor Eb Anus historicized this kind of current decolonizing moment within longer debates that called to restructure the field in the past. I think that it's worth mentioning a couple of important points that she brought, or like the points of development of these ideas. Or these debates. So we have early 1990s with Marco Pawlyszyń's work on the application of coloniality and post-coloniality rather than colonialism and post-colonialism to the study of Ukrainian literature. We have early 2000s with a roundtable with Vitaly Chernetsky, Are We Post-Colonial? And Vitaly was the chair of the last panel. And we have also this almost iconic text of Catherine Verdery and Shard Chari on thinking between posts. So simultaneously to these debates, there have been a growing scholarly attention to investigate the imperialist aspect of Russian history and culture in particular. And of course, like mentioning all the works right now would require additional session. So let me just refer to some scholars or some works that influence my work. Like, for example, the works by late Mark von Hagen, Miroslav Shkandry, Jane Burbeck, and Frank Cooper, almost encyclopedic work on empires in world history, Yuri Slevsky, Bruce Grant, and works on Central Asia, of course. And here I'm thinking in particular about like Sarah Cameron and her work on collectivization famines in Kazakhstan. So imperialism and or colonialism has been discussed from various vantage points. It's not my kind of goal right now to summarize those studies. Rather, it is to point that the imperial perspective, as well as the debates about the applicability of colonial and post-colonial lenses to the study of the region, has been present in the field for quite some time. And certainly the current escalation of the war in Ukraine that came with the full-scale Russian invasion brought, I mean, like the invasion that is by many discussed as a colonial war, brought a renewed interest in this imperial perspective. And I think that the last two panels in the series made like excellent job in kind of pointing and this history. But I want to focus on something different. As I said, I want to focus on decolonization as a question of knowledge production that manifests itself in the framing of the field within American academia. And again, some of those issues have been here for quite some time. So in Poland, or more broadly in Central and Eastern Europe scholarship, the early 2000s was a moment of this kind of critical reflection over ways in which the region is theorized in an Anglophone literature. And I'm thinking about this kind of criticism or skepticism of the post-socialist framework mainly. So it led to the criticism of the specter of Orientalism to kind of use the framing of Polish anthropologist Michał Buchowski, namely this kind of relations of power in constituting the field and discourses that made and sustained them. So in Poland, where I started to be engaged in these debates, still as a baby scholar, we ask about knowledge in and about Eastern Europe, like whose knowledge mattered and why. Why was the local scholarship so rarely included in the Anglophone literature? Why were we the subjects of knowledge production, not necessarily the partners? What were the rules of transnational conversations? And why did we kind of lose the game? But also as students, I was an undergrad student at that time, we created like several conferences in which we were also trying to think critically about our own orientalizing practices. Many of us started to work in our East, so in Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, in Central Asia, and we were kind of actively advocating towards diversifying our scholarship and strengthening the transnational connections between scholars and students, especially in regards to the topics that we considered sensitive. So upon my arrival to the US and the start of my PhD journey, everything shifted, or so I thought. In 2014, I was no longer part of the local voice, but I was in New York, very much at the center of knowledge production, or what I thought back then. I mean, like 8 years changed many things. I was still interested in Ukrainian history and culture, yet I was enrolled in a university, the new school, that doesn't really have this area studies component. Thus, my work needed to develop in an interdisciplinary way, in conversations with scholars working on various regions, from East Asia to post-colonial Egypt, who use different theoretical glasses. I mean, post-colonial studies is just like one of them, and draw from various empirical materials. The importance of my project or the importance of my interest were not given, but needed to gradually develop through this kind of omnipresent sociological questions like, why should we care? At the same time, and this kind of very early stages, I was also taking classes on Soviet and East European history and culture outside the new school, only to experience that the so-called mainstream classes on Soviet history, and my apologies for generalizations at this point, would focus mostly on Moscow political affairs and Russia as a republic in particular, with just like little space devoted for anything else. So let's say that in the course of the semester, maybe 1 or 2 classes on the Soviet history would be, dedicated to all Soviet republics, or would pack like everything like together with Central Asia. If I wanted to study Ukrainian history, I needed to take classes specifically on the subject. The topic of Ukraine was rarely included in the so-called mainstream. Moreover, the mainstream Soviet classes gathered auditoria for 70 students. Classes of Ukraine would bring maybe 14 students, and half of them being of Ukrainian origin. Moreover, at the same time, I was developing interest in studying the famine of 1932-33. And many of my area studies colleagues reacted very suspiciously, telling me that, if not accusing me, that I'm being political or that my topic is highly politicized. A label that I need to admit I did not understand for quite some time. So I'm bringing all these examples, not so much to point at certain institutional formation and domination or systems of domination within the Slavic field, like here in the States. I think that this is important discussion, and some of these issues, should be faced. I'm bringing all these examples not really to criticize the area studies as such, but rather to state a very, very obvious thing. Namely, that the way the field is organized here in the United States, it's not universal, it's not objective, but it is a consequence of certain political and cultural developments that structured the field in a given way. And the call to decolonize the field is part of this long durée. So I found myself in a very peculiar situation, as clash between like one group that deemed my topic as being kind of too political, and the others for whom it was largely non-existent. So I refer here to my broader sociological audience that did not have much knowledge about like either the famine, collectivization famine, or like Stalinist period in particular. So this is this content mantra of like, why should we care? So I'm kind of mentioning this only to point at this kind of rather peripheral place of Eastern Europe within broader fields of sociology and political studies, this kind of drying up of the field to use this metaphor of Michael Barnhart and Krzysztof Jasiewicz in their discussion of this kind of ontological status of the region within this more generalizable social scientific knowledge within American academia. So here I would like to pose maybe a provocative question, like to what extent this kind of recent decolonization of making this kind of bridges between colonialism and like Eastern Europe is really a kind of a partial response to this ontological status of our region. And one of its aims is really to kind of bring it back. So this autobiographical note of being a flaneur between academic traditions and practices was really an excuse to tell a bigger story about the need to really unpack like certain cultural schema that I think mask and legitimize certain forms of domination in the framing of East European studies within American academia. And I propose like 3 dimensions now. So the current decolonizing moment, I think is just one in many kind of similar attempts to really reimagine the field, right? So decolonization as a reimagination. As a model, the decolonization is not universal, rather than stating the need to decolonize Eastern European studies, maybe we should ask, how do American academia colonize the region in the first place, and colonize in the epistemic understanding or epistemic ways? How certain epistemic classes have been created and become dominant in framing the region? And my point is that in order to decolonize, we need to kind of critically examine politics that created the knowledge about the region in the first place. My second point is that maybe decolonizing really means simply diversifying and decentralizing the field. And this includes not only how the region is taught, although I think that this is a very important part of the conversation, but also which are the places that are considered as being worth studied, where the graduate students are encouraged to do their research, which archives are those that they should visit, which sources are regarded as legitimate sources to study the past, and finally, which topics are deemed important and which are too political, and why is it so? My third point is that maybe to decolonize means to think about the region through transnational and interdisciplinary lenses. To think about the region not as an empty terrain of theory application, but theory generation. I think that this is particularly important because I think that some part of this discussion on decolonization brings the danger of thinking about colonialism and post-colonialism as some kind of fixed and static theories that can be simply applied on the region, rather than thinking about coloniality, post-coloniality as some kind of ongoing formations of domination. So I think that making the comparative and conceptual links to other area studies is of particular importance, and it should be discussed. Lastly, I should say something about my research on the famine and how my positionality led me to focus on the question of the knowledge production. So in my dissertation, rather than asking about the causes of the famine, which are especially highly debated in American academia, my dissertation asks about how the competing narratives about the famine were produced by different actors, including the Soviet state, local Communist Party bureaucrats, as secret police informants, survivors, foreign journalists, and members of the Ukrainian diaspora in North America. I traced these competing narratives that emerged during the famine in the early 1930s and were reframed time and again during the Cold War to this kind of post-socialist era when Ukraine became an independent state. In reconstructing these narratives, I demonstrate why some narratives prevailed over others, how new narratives emerged and were disseminated, and how the epistemic power of various narratives shifted over time, carrying important ramifications for Ukrainian national identity, Russian-Ukrainian relations, but also outside perception of the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, broadly speaking. So my quest to decolonize the field, but also shift the way the ways in which we kind of know the famine, led me not only to frame my case within the comparative literature on famines, but also to conduct multinational and multilingual research in Austria, Canada, Germany, Poland, Ukraine, and the United States, during which I conducted archival research, I did interviews with Ukrainian diaspora activists, and I conducted ethnography in the Ukrainian countryside. My dissertation combines then primary archival sources with interviews, oral testimonies, memoirs, to further highlight the uneven distribution of epistemic power in the perception, in the production of knowledge, and demonstrate how the perception of the past depends on the positionality of social actors and the symbolic control over means through which the past and the field can be studied. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karolina, and thank you for raising questions that I think we will come back to in the discussion. Next, we have Masha Shinkarenko, who will be talking about her research.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you so much, Davis Center, for inviting me to participate in this wonderful panel. And I want to say special thanks to the Ukrainian Armed Forces for defending us all today and giving the most important thing that they have. So I would like to share a screen. Just a second. There you go. Okay. Okay. All right. So today we discuss a lot of ways how decolonization in Slavic Eastern European studies can happen, and considering the previous two presentations and the kind of the conversation that is happening in many different institutions, we kind of can define different ways that or different approaches to decolonization of the field. One of it is institutional. It's when we talk about sources and distribution of funding that supports what research, what regions are we studying, the allocations of positions within the field, the use of libraries and archives. So this is one approach, institutional. Another approach to decolonization is through teaching. How do we design a syllabus to address the blind spots? What are the pedagogical tools we use? And finally, we are also talking about, of course, decolonization of knowledge production and epistemologies that Karolina has mentioned. And when people talk about decolonization of knowledge production, it usually means unlearning Western and Russian thinking, recovering the erased histories, decentering Russia in favor of other decolonial perspectives. So I think that all those three components are very, very important to kind of go hand in hand. We can't just pay attention to the institutional decolonization, but disregard teaching or disregard how we actually produce knowledge. So it is very important that they go all together. As an emerging scholar, I would like to focus more on what I know best, and this is on producing knowledge. And I'm going to talk about particularly using the example, the case of my research. I study Crimean Tatars, I study Crimea, and it is today very, as Karolina would say, politicized topic. So first of all, before I move to decolonial approach, I would like to ask, what does it actually mean in practice to decolonize the system of knowledge production. So what it actually means to when we say that we need to unlearn Russian thinking, and we usually mean that we need to stop using Russocentric perspective. But what is Russocentric perspective? Where do we see it, and how do we define it? And I would like to suggest 2 examples in my field, and that is several statements or narratives that are very widely used, and that I kind of would like to suggest just a few examples, some quotes. The first statement is that Crimea is important and vital for the Russian identity, and thus is of crucial strategic significance. And this is something that you can find both in academic articles, in just newspaper articles about Crimea. And so why, so this statement that Crimea is so important for Russian identity is usually backed by historical arguments, and it revokes or invokes the Crimean War or World War II, the many years of Crimea being part of Russian and Soviet systems. And so why is this perspective Russocentric? Well, first of all, because it completely erases the experiences of other national groups, such as Crimean Tatars, for example. Why don't we ask questions why Crimea is so important for Crimean Tatars or other minorities that live in Crimea and consider it their homeland? So why do we focus so much on what it means for Russia that has annexed it in 2014? But there is also, of course, very serious implications of such statements. And one of it is political implications of justification for Russia's annexation, and also cautioning against the liberation of Crimea, framing Putin's retaliation as inevitable, and putting responsibility on the potential liberation on Western and Ukrainian shoulders. So there is a quote, for example, that says that whether the Ukraine war brings on a global catastrophe will hinge in large part on whether Washington decides to back the Ukrainian effort to retake the Crimean Peninsula. And this conclusion is supported by the statement that Crimea is of such a significant importance to Russia that any attempt to liberate it will inevitably provoke some kind of retaliation. So one more example of the Russocentric perspective when we talk about Crimea in particularly concerns this really strong emphasis on Russia's majority and the support for the annexation. We also see in very respective publishings that this statement that since 1991, when Crimea became part of Ukraine, there has been this strong Russian majority population, and how it was treated, how it was very pro-Russian. And of course, this narrative completely kind of neglected everyone else who was living in Crimea. It didn't even ask a question how it happened that a Russian majority lived in Crimea and not, for example, Crimean Tatars. And since 2014, there has also has been this emphasis on pro-Russian support of Crimean population, that even though the annexation itself was illegal and the referendum was, as some says, far from ideal, it's still worth acknowledging that a lot of people actually support the annexation. And so scholars who use this kind of perspective, they also rely on as you can see here from quotes, they also rely on opinion polls conducted by the Russian polling agency, which is from my own research it's not reliable to conduct. It is very hard to conduct any opinion poll in the area that is occupied, that is where people live under occupation. And when I was in Crimea in 2020, I would say that most all of my respondents who are Crimean Tatars were living in such a terror and fear that they would probably not even participate in such pollings, let alone express their true thoughts or true opinion about the annexation. So this is just a few examples of what it means to produce a Russocentric perspective. And I would like to move to the decolonial approach and what do we mean when we talk about decolonial approach. And I would like to kind of stipulate that decoloniality or post-colonial thought is not my area of expertise. I think of it more as an approach to kind of a methodological tool or approach to understand how I should be studying my area that is mostly focusing on identities, resistance of Crimean Tatars. So when we lose the decolonial lenses, what we find out is that, first of all, we need to decenter Russia, focus on the subaltern voices, but that doesn't mean necessarily that we just need to substitute one national history with another, but that we need to produce knowledge of societies that kind of highlight the experiences of societies that have been for a long time oppressed. And that would also produce a more comprehensive, more thick account, critical account of Russia's social structures and political systems. So by decentering Russia, it doesn't mean that we need to stop studying Russia and start studying something else, but it actually means studying through all these different multiple perspectives, studying how the social structure works. So, for example, when we move from the Russocentric perspective on Crimea and we start from Crimean Tatar, we actually discover that Russia's rule in Crimea since 18th century can be easily conceptualized as a classic settler colonialism, which is so familiar in the Western context. Yet we don't really think along those lines about Crimea, for example. We also notice that such but also familiar tools of Western imperialism also present in Crimea, like the land dispossession, resettlement of Russians to Crimea, ethnic violence, cultural assimilation. So when we learn all that, we understand that when scholars talk about the importance of Crimea for Russia's identity, they actually fail to notice the history of settler colonialism, the erasure of indigenous landscape, the practices of demographic engineering that allowed this myth of Russia's Crimea to take root. So they're just taking for granted it, and they don't really interrogate. And even when they talk about the pro-Russian population or the majority of Russian population, you cannot really talk about that without contextualizing and without considering all these processes of demographic engineering, such as deportations, resettlement. So this actually normalizes Russia's historical and contemporary imperialism instead of challenging it. So the second aspect of decolonial approach that I think is very, very important is to allow this multiplicity of different forms of colonialism, imperialism, decolonization to kind of enrich our scholarship. Because what we learned from this war is that the discussions on imperialism and decolonization in North America and in Eastern Europe, they don't really connect. And why they don't connect, I think, is because of this inflexibility and rigidity of conceptual apparatus that only counts particular Western form of imperialism. And the proof for that, we can bring the decades of discussion of whether Soviet Union was empire or not. But this disconnection is actually odd because the experiences of colonized people are so similar. The Crimean Tatars have experienced the same land dispossession, cultural assimilation, violence, that are the experiences that are just as relevant in Crimea as in the US, for example, or in Canada. But there are also major differences, of course. And I think that decolonial approach should allow for the multiplicity of all these different experiences to count. So the differences should not be seen as impediments to kind of bringing this comparative perspectives, but actually kind of key blocks to refine our conceptual and theoretical apparatus. So I think those are two kind of major aspects of the decolonial approach that I wanted to share, and I will stop here, and I will be happy to discuss in more details during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Masha, for that. And I think likewise, we will return to questions of sort of where reflexivity has brought us over the last couple of decades in examining certain imperial legacies and not others in the processes of knowledge accumulation and construction. So now we'll turn to Amanda, and with apologies and an attempt to repair my elision at the beginning, the other university at which Amanda had taught for our Czech colleagues was the Uniwersytet Jana Amosa Komenského in Prague. So Amanda, please take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jessica, and thank you to the organizers for having us on this panel today and part of this important discussion as well. I'm speaking to you today from my position as a US American scholar. I'm a fourth generation Armenian, Ukrainian, and Polish family, and I've lived and worked in Russia and in the Czech Republic, as Jessica reminded us. And I currently teach at an elite liberal arts college, which is located on land that belongs to the traditional territory of the Erie and Haudenosaunee confederacies. I'll also speak from the position of a political scientist, which offers particular challenges and opportunities for the decolonization debate. So I'm going to lean on my position as a North American scholar on this panel to talk about the research that I've done in terms of this broader conversation about decolonization that's been ongoing in North America for decades, centuries, depending on whom you ask. And I want to introduce two methodological points into that conversation. So the first is that we could think more expansively about area studies and what area studies can mean. The second is that we could think more expansively about what it means to decenter empire, and specifically Russia, in the field. So I'll start off by emphasizing that these decolonizing approaches can be used to answer very mainstream political science or social science questions, such as what causes institutional convergence. And so decolonization does not mean changing everything about what we study or where we study. It does mean a radical change in epistemological approach, though. So through my dissertation research, I was asking that mainstream question, right? What causes institutional convergence? I wanted to understand why Russia and Brazil developed the same very specific set of institutions to govern their oil industries. Both had partially privatized their national oil companies at the same time that they renationalized the oil itself. And on the surface, these two countries have very little in common that could explain this similarity. One was an autocracy, the other a democracy. One is a colonizer, the other a former colony. One had long produced oil primarily onshore, the other had just discovered oil deep offshore, right? So one question that has been introduced in this decolonization debate is whether we need Eastern European and Eurasian area studies as a field at all. And not just introduced in this particular debate, but as Carolina said, has been ongoing for a very long time. I think it's self-evident that the skills associated with area studies are necessary for understanding the world. However, different regions don't have to be siloed from each other, right? Had I compared Russia to countries in Eastern Europe and Brazil to countries in Latin America, I would have come to erroneous conclusions about national level causes for their institutional choices. So in the spirit of decolonization, I want to highlight that comparative area studies is a growing field for emerging scholars that offers one path towards decolonizing, putting the insights from Eastern Europe and Eastern European and Eurasian countries in the context of global debates. So in the end, in my research, I concluded that institutional convergence was driven by Russia's and Brazil's similar positions in the global economy, right? Both were classified as commodity-dependent emerging markets, which forced on them a particular kind of market discipline. They had to overcome the original sin of state ownership and the market spooking nationalization of oil resources. And they overcame this by professionalizing their national oil companies and listing them on international stock exchanges, right? So joining the global world order in a very particular way. They also crafted policies to diversify their economies away from natural resources and to grow their own knowledge industries or become knowledge economies in the European style. This provided markets with transparency about their operations, and the countries gained a group of global shareholders who were invested in their success, which I think is important to Russia's increasing imperial moves today. This imposition of market discipline only became apparent to me by taking the global oil industry itself as an object of analysis. So I didn't just do fieldwork in Russia and Brazil, right? I did fieldwork in the global oil industry as it is instantiated in those two places. The methodological point here is that area studies does not only have to mean geographical entities or be about geographical entities. Area can also refer to professional cultures. We can approach a professional culture with relevant language skills, historical knowledge, and contextualizing experience, just as we would a national culture. And this can be decolonizing because it doesn't reify national culture on the 18th or 19th century European model, but rather makes room for overlapping cultures at work. Furthermore, it's fruitful to pay attention to the work that national identities do in the worlds that we study. So in the oil industry, Russian and Brazilian companies have very different reputations. And here I turn to my second methodological point, right, specific to Russia and decentering empire. Brazil's company Petrobras, through its own technical expertise, had discovered the huge deposits of pre-salt oil off the coast of Rio de Janeiro. This organic discovery is how the company grew in stature and in profits, right? But Russia's company Rosneft had a very different path to its greatness. It acquired, often with the help of the Russian government, other companies that had significant oil producing assets, Yukos, TNKVP, Bashneft, among others. These national reputations that Russia and Brazil had, given the different strategies they pursued in the industry, it influenced the willingness of international oil companies to work with them and where they would work with them, what kind of contracts they could use. So one further illustration of how these differing representations leads to us thinking about decolonization being a question of epistemology and not about identity or subject, right? So one of my Latin American interlocutors described the difference between the Russian and Brazilian companies to me in terms that are extremely colonial, but not obviously colonial. If you're thinking about decolonization as a question of changing the identity or shifting the focus, then you wouldn't necessarily think of this as a colonial statement, but when thinking epistemologically, it certainly is. So what he said to me was that the Russian companies are very, very well respected, but they're dirty. He's using an idiom of dirty and clean. Petrobras used to be like that and became clean. And by clean, I mean they standardized technologies, got patents, published papers, disseminated knowledge between other countries, and got closest to the international oil companies. Russia's companies are dirty because they found solutions through practical methods, not much theoretical, and they still see it as an inside knowledge thing. So they were publishing primarily in Russian among their colleagues rather than disseminating the knowledge internationally in English. Petrobras was contributing to the universal knowledge of the oil industry while the Russians were not, right? So my interlocutor, right, in Brazil is reproducing this hierarchy, which puts specific local knowledge at the bottom, considers it a resource to be mined, and universal theoretical knowledge at the top. And this is a hierarchy we see reproduced not only in the oil industry, but also in academia. So I study Russia and its oil industry, right, which is about as close to the center of empire as you can get, right? The methodological point I want to make about decentering empire is that we do so not by shifting our geographical focus necessarily, but by shifting the imperial ground on which we stand to look at it. And here I'm really echoing what Masha told us a few moments ago. So instead of asking, did all those expropriations of other companies help Rosneft succeed in the global economy, I asked a question like, how and why did Rosneft measure success in such a way that expropriation seemed the best path forward? This is a similar move to the one that Carolina makes. There are a set of idiosyncratic and specific standards of success in the global oil industry, one of which is a pipeline of oil fields at different stages of development. Companies have to meet these standards to be successful to raise their shareholder value, right? So expropriating other companies allowed Rosneft to build that pipeline. But I could only see this dynamic by examining how success is measured in the global oil industry, and specifically by Western oil companies and institutions like stock markets. So this brings me to my closing point. Colonization constructs the West as well. Part of the Decolonizing Eastern European and Eurasian Studies project, and I think this is the special, but certainly not the sole responsibility of Western scholars in the field, is to turn the lens back on the space called the West that we inhabit and that we represent, and consider how the hierarchies that we're projecting outward are reflections of the hierarchies that we carry within. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Amanda. It's a real pleasure to have this conversation. For those of you who are tuning in, the conversation among the scholars present at this panel, started around a dining room table 6 years ago, and continued on a weekly or biweekly basis on Zoom throughout the pandemic. But it's an ongoing conversation with a lot of sort of common points that you may have heard through the presentations today. I'm going to ask a question of the people who've submitted questions, and then while waiting for an answer, I have a couple of questions or points for the panelists. So for the people who have submitted questions, if you could please let us know if you would like us to identify you by name in responding in asking your question. That would be very helpful. So maybe one of the questions that is kind of related to something that one of the scholars who submitted a question has asked is that the matter of kind of what has happened over the last few decades with respect to reflexivity in different fields in the social sciences and humanities about the perspectives. This is along the lines of some of the questions that Masha raised about where are our perspectives rooted, and how can we make visible the processes of production of those perspectives, as Carolina alluded to. One of the things that has sort of occurred to me as listening to you and throughout our conversations over the years is this idea that after the end of the Cold War or dissolution of the Soviet Union, or whatever phrase you'd like to use to describe that process and in its ongoing various iterations, is the idea that on the one hand, there was, it seems to me, some kind of consciousness taking about the role of US imperialism and Cold War politics in the construction of narratives about the region. It's not clear to me that in the social sciences there was as much of a reflexive move with respect to the extent to which we had, as social scientists, integrated without reflection Soviet era and Soviet frameworks for thinking about the world, which is to say that there's sort of this, back and forth between American and Russian imperialism and the rejection of one, but perhaps, falling into the embrace of the other. And I wondered if you could reflect upon that, and in the context also of a question related from the audience about whether you think that Russocentrism and neglect of non-Russian perspectives, the erasure of non-Russian past, has also been characteristic of Western historiography of the Russian and Soviet Empire since 1991. So that's a question to all of you.
I can start. I think that what I wanted to point in my presentation is that, hierarchies of knowledge and power exists like everywhere. I think that it's like very easy right now to kind of blame American academia for all the and point in the need of decolonizing, point and colonizing, but I think that hierarchies of knowledge are everywhere, right? And everywhere, including in Europe, European academia, we have our own kind of demons we want to fight. But I think that this particular Russocentrism that I think that we all kind of refer to, I think that there is something highly peculiar when it comes to American academia, and I think that Jessica rightly points at the Cold War. I wouldn't say though that it originates in 1991. I think that it started like way earlier, where from American perspective, really like what was Soviet like equaled Russian, Russian equals Soviet, and this kind of imagination that there are like others living in the region that identify themselves in a different way was like very, very suspicious, right? And I think that this is why at the same time, if we are talking about like Cold War politics, and this is where my research is kind of also focusing on, the Department of State and the CIA invested like a lot of energy to really kind of bring the nationalism back, right? So this is like very kind of complex set of relations. But shortly to respond really shortly, yes, there is something peculiar to American academia, and I was like thinking about this when I was actually listening to Masha's presentation, and I was thinking how the story of Crimea is told, like in Central Europe, for example. This is not a Russocentric perspective of Crimea. Our history of Crimea is the history of Crimean Tatars, right? We can talk a little bit more whether Western Europe sees it in the same way, but I think that this would be also like more towards the Central European than the American perspectives, right? So yeah, I will maybe stop here.
If I might, before we go on to Amanda and Masha, if you'd like to weigh in, I think this is also connected to some of the debates in parts of countries formerly colonized by the Soviet Union, right, about their own role. I'm thinking about some of Zabushko's recent writings, right, and that we see in geopolitics. Just for example, the absolutely bizarre situation in which the UN Security Council now finds itself, right, with Russia occupying a seat that has a veto while conducting its war in Ukraine is, as many Ukrainian officials have recently pointed out, right, it's a legacy of just a kind of tacit process by which Russia came to occupy that seat after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, without really questioning, who ought to represent, what is the successor state to the Soviet Union, and what does it mean to make decisions about that in international law? So that raises a whole set of other questions, right? That, as Carolina really rightly points out, these are decades old concerns that really have only recently been treated in American academic space, broadly speaking. Amanda and Masha, did you want to weigh in on this question before we move on to others?
Yeah, I can just say a few words. I also, as Carolina, I believe that the roots are far further than 1991. But what kind of just mentioning a little bit of my experience as an emerging scholar, because I haven't really touched on that in my presentation. When I started work, when I came to New York to do my research, I happened to study in a really amazing place called New School, and there, as Carolina said, there are no regional studies. So I actually never even got exposed to what is Slavic studies or Eastern European studies. But what I noticed is that when I started studying Crimean Tatars, it was the sources of funding that were open to me were very much centered in the Russian field, which for me was very strange because I considered Crimea as part of Ukraine, and I thought that this is really was strange that I should apply for or should find connection to Russia and apply for Russian studies. But this is really how this kind of how the field is institutionalized. That yeah, that's just some experience.
I had a similar experience in terms of being funneled toward Russia and away from Central and Eastern Europe as a field of study, because that's where the resources were. I also, just in response to the original question, had a similar intervention to Jessica's, which is just the idea that there's one Soviet perspective, right? Or that the Soviet Union was an entity with one history is something that continues to be reproduced. And it might be more useful to think of it as an umbrella over like a space that has multiple histories happening instead. So Soviet histories, if we want to go there instead, because there's multiple Soviet perspectives, not just the one, unless it's the Imperial one, right, that is constructed and reproduced and continuing to have impacts on the categories that we're using today. So.
Yeah, very much more to say about that, but maybe we'll go on to the questions from the audience, and perhaps we'll come back to that if we have time. This is related directly to a question from a librarian at Harvard named Christine Jacobson. Thank you for your question, which goes like this. I noticed that two of the speakers touched on the role libraries, archives, and primary sources play in the production of Russocentric knowledge production. So I'm wondering if they can say more about the kinds of archives and sources North American academia has traditionally pushed scholars toward. How have the speakers or their colleagues pushed back against those expectations? Moreover, what kind of resources would you like to see collected and made available by U.S. libraries with budgets for collecting regional material? Like scholars, librarians, and curators have been engaged in conversations for decades about decolonizing our collections, but for similar reasons outlined by the speakers, demand, institutional support, funding continues to be a struggle.
I can start again because I think that I also brought this point. I mean, I think that this is not going to be an overstatement to say that there has been a fetishization of archives in regards to Soviet history and East European history. And this is again, and I mean, and this is a kind of partially a result the fact that the archives were closed. So there was an expectation that, that all these white spots, all these true stories are going to be revealed one day. And I mean, if you think about Sovietology as such, and if you think about how the field developed, it actually very much corresponded to what was available, right? So it, especially in the 1990s, it went, I mean, it kind of led to these discussions about exactly, maybe not fetishization, but gold rush mentality, discovering, discovering the truth about the Soviet past. And I think that it is like this, right? So there is still this kind of, I think that if we talk about decolonization, I think that the history of Soviet Union when it comes to the archives didn't really pass through the decolonization in a similar way that the post-colonial studies, I think, did quite some time. So this, what I want to say is that this fetishization of documents, I think that is here much stronger than it is in the case of post-colonial studies. And I think that this issue should be really addressed. And I mean, the question is like, the question is really serious, given that, I mean, in the future, I don't think that any research is going to be possible in Russia and Ukraine. And I've been talking with many of my friends who also, who are studying Central Asia and who actually don't want to go to Russia to do any research. So I think that this is a pressing problem. But I also think that a lot has been done in terms of digitalization of the archives, digitalization of the sources. So I think that my one suggestion maybe would be to make those archives, those sources visible, because I think that they are, I mean, like right now you can really access many things or many documents, many archives from the United States, but you are just, as students, we are not always aware that this is possible. So this would be like one thing. But I think that in my presentation, I also referred to this kind of not only fetishization of documents, but also the fetishization of Russian archives in particular. I think that for a very long time in history, there was this kind of thinking that to study the region means to study the region through the lenses of Russian archives. This is where students would go. I think that this changed quite some time ago, and it changed when the Soviet security services of Ukraine opened their KGB archives, and this was really the moment of shift that many scholars interested in this topic really kind of rushed to Ukrainian archives. So I think that this is also important to acknowledge this, that there are hierarchies in kind of our thinking about the archives. And this is maybe not our role as emerging scholars, but maybe those who curate us to kind of point and really kind of different places to do our research.
Masha or Amanda, would you like to weigh in on this one?
Just briefly, I don't know if it's institutionally possible to do this with the funds that you have, but if it's possible to put institutional funds from the West towards supporting efforts of archive creation in the region, rather than sort of bringing things here in the sort of British Museum style to have them. Digital archives is one option for that. That could be something nice. I was trying to find the link to share with everyone, couldn't in time, but there's at least one initiative for Ukrainian journals that's been underway. And so institutionalizing those relationships, I think, could be something really exciting for archival purposes.
Well, I would like to maybe, I'm sorry, Masha, I would like to maybe point at another thing that I haven't mentioned, which is connected with diaspora materials. I mean, we kind of circle around the issue of the role of diaspora in kind of knowledge production about the region, like here in the States. But I should acknowledge that I don't think that Ukrainian Americans are not the only ones who develop like really interesting institutions like museum archives that are scattered around North America, that I think that should be also somewhere in our attention. Of course, like every archives, we need to think about them through certain kind of hierarchies of knowledge that created those places. But I think that they also tell some part of the story of the region and of the field that has been neglected for quite some time. And from my experience of working in within like Ukrainian community, I need to say that I think that those places have been also neglected by the Ukrainian American community. There was the moment when the museum archives were really kind of institutions of knowledge production and distribution. I think that for the contemporary generations of migrants, this is like no longer the case. But I would certainly point also at this like counter spaces where certain narrative were produced, of course, like critically thinking about how those places were produced in the first place.
Masha, did you want to weigh in, or I have a follow-up question for Carolina about that? So well, not just for Carolina, but following on Carolina's comment. So, I mean, one of the abiding frictions in thinking about decolonizing processes has to do then with the extent to which bringing new sources or sources previously, right, not at the center of narratives, then can become an extractive enterprise. What does it mean to think about decontextualization here? You know, the idea of kind of cafeteria style, right, choosing different sources and pieces of knowledge that come out of highly local, integral, anchored and produced in and through specific communities, knowledges. What does it mean for scholars then to want to try to bring some of those perspectives into the center? I mean, here we get back to this this problem of the relationship between identitarian politics and epistemological approaches to decolonization. How are you thinking about that?
Ooh, this is a big question. Well, I think that you kind of used the key key problem here, or like key notion, which is the contextualization of the sources. I mean, like, you know, regardless where the sources are kind of coming from. I think that like part of the problem of these debates in the 1990s, which were really kind of around, you know, the fetishization of documents, is that, oh, you know, the documents tell us the Soviet perspective, let's use the oral testimonies to get the counter narrative. I mean, like, not necessarily, like memoirs, oral testimonies, they are also products of certain hierarchies of knowledge, and we need to contextualize them in order to actually use them, because if we do, we actually may see something different about certain relations of domination that brought those sources into existence. And I think that with this, you know, diaspora counter archives I was referring to, I think that this kind of contextualization of the sources is like absolutely crucial. And to be honest, I think that we haven't done this job in Eastern Europe. I think that, again, to kind of bring this relation to post-colonial studies, I think that these discussions, you know, started there like quite some time ago, and they succeeded in thinking about developing methodologies of like working with archives, working with sources. I think that we still need to do this job in Eastern Europe, precisely to kind of demythologize you know, our thinking about archives and how to read those archives and what kind of sources brought those archives into existence, but also, you know, memoirs, also testimonies, also like counter archives, because like otherwise there is a trap of this kind of Cold War binary of like good versus evil, you know, good archives versus you know, history versus memory, and this kind of elements. This would be my quick response.
Yeah, do the others have thoughts about this?
I can say something, Masha, unless you would like to. Okay. I think in addition to contextualization, maybe collaboration is another, like, just to make it alliterative word we could throw into this question, right? Like, not every question is a question that I as an individual have to answer or take up, right? Or maybe taking it up in partnership with, and truly partnership with, people who are closer to the context or have a different perspective on the context can be one way to work on that. I also was just reaching for my Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, who I've been was teaching yesterday and have been thinking about a lot in the context of this particular conversation. But she has a critique of the idea of authenticity as well. And like part of the fetishization of the archive is the idea that if you can just get the right authentic source, you'll have the capital T truth of the situation. And letting go of some of our pursuit of capital T truths in the interest of understanding multiple truths that are circulating, I think is also useful.
Masha, do you want to say something, or I don't want to interrupt?
No, yeah, I also agree, I guess. So we kind of want to avoid the situation where we just substitute kind of one national history with another national history, or when we just do this kind of work of decentering without actually kind of critically analyzing. And yeah, as Carolina was saying, like contextualizing all like those experiences that we study. So yeah.
It raises some interesting questions, and also a really serious problem, right? Coming back to the problem that we were talking about a moment ago, which is that in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine, it's going to be very difficult to do research for many people in many places in those two countries for some period of time. And so the whole question of, recontextualization, it may be possible to obtain certain types of materials, but being able to really sort of engage with those materials, whether they be archival or sources or oral history or surveys or you name it, being able not only to conduct that research, but to kind of discuss it in situ, right, is going to be difficult. And even deciding what in situ means amid, on the one hand, a deliberate effort to deterritorialize a population, and on the other, a complete sort of shutdown in people's ability to express themselves. So I wonder sort of how we're going to think about that going forward. And that's kind of related to another question that one of our panel audience members posed, which is sort of this idea that, the idea of colonialism has been brought up before. As Carolina has highlighted, this is a long-term conversation in Eastern Europe about decolonization. To what extent do we think that this is a fashion, right? In the American academic context, and what can we do so that it's not just that, right? How is this going to look, not just intellectually, but also in the ways in which our intellectual work is institutionalized and expressed through distribution of resources, expressed through organizations? How do we want to think about that? So on the one hand, the constraints created, at least in two national contexts, by the current situation, and on the other, sort of, what are the ways in which, how do you see some kind of deeper transformation happening in scholarship here over the longer term?
I can start again. Okay, so I'm going to be like quite pessimistic, partially because I'm Polish, to say that I think that this is a moment that is happening right now, and it like very much depends on us whether it will leave some traces in ways in which the scholarship is organized. And I'm thinking here in particular about all these, various moments in the past when Eastern Europe was brought back, right? And it was always kind of brought back within the American academia when there were moments of crisis, right? So this was obviously not only the dissolution of the Soviet Union, not only what happened in Yugoslavia, but also earlier with the Solidarity movement, with various resistance in the resistance waves in the socialist bloc. So what I think that what remained from these moments of bringing Eastern Europe back is really certain kind of theories and approaches that were generated in the region, right? So if we think about solidarity movement, if we think about social movements in general, when we think about civil society, and so on and so forth. So I think that when it comes to this moment we have right now, I mean, it will pass, but I think that we have the ability to really kind of think critically about like generating, not like applying something and like onto the region, but really kind of generating something from the region to really kind of mark certain shifts in ways in which not only the region is perceived, but something, you know, much more broader than this.
Yeah, thanks, Carolina. Are there thoughts about this? I mean, this is obviously a very open-ended and big question that also has implications for things like language training and all kinds of other questions in the production of knowledge and the training of young and emerging scholars.
I would add that I'm also not as optimistic as Carolina, and I think there is so much, even though there is a real kind of moment now, it also requires efforts from so many different actors, as it cannot be just a conversation among students and faculty. How do we conduct research? It has to be a conversation on so many different levels like how does the where does the funding go, what kind of positions we have. Honestly, since the beginning of the war, there has been an expectation that now there will be more positions and more interest to study and learn and teach something in other regions, not just Russia and not just Ukraine, because everyone is now interested in Ukraine. But unfortunately, we see that we only have just a couple of visiting professorships, just a couple of tenure positions, but the interest in Russian studies is still predominant. And even when there is kind of an attempt to diversify, the framing is usually Russian studies, but with the knowledge of some other regional language or some other like regional culture, which kind of proves the point of the need to decolonization. So I think there is, I mean, academia is always very kind of, there's lots of inertia, and it always takes a long time, in my opinion, to kind of move with such a big structure. But I think it's also a matter of time that such a big changes don't really happen overnight, and it's just a continuous work that has to be done on multiple levels.
It's a tough one too, right? Because it's a circular process in which there's the discussions about decolonization are happening everywhere. I mean, in Ukraine, right, there are these incredibly lively debates going on, but access to them requires either people already to have been trained in the Ukrainian language in North America, or for Ukrainian scholars to conduct their discussions in the English language. So there's sort of a reproduction, right, of a colonial gaze or of siloed knowledge. And so sort of how do we break out of that? Seem institutionally and then more broadly, it seems like a kind of central question. Amanda, did you want to weigh in on this question, if you would like?
I only wanted to comment that I agree with the pessimism, but the pessimism is also performative, right? If we believe it's going to be that way, it could end up being that way. And so I'm going to do a little bit of performative optimism and say that, you know, every institution, every tenure line, everything that gets created in this moment is going to reap dividends for the next 50 years, right, as emerging scholars get into positions and so on. And so I guess that's more of a call for immediate action along the lines of what they were describing in order to performatively get optimistic about it.
Sure. And I think, I mean, maybe this is actually a place where we could land in the discussion. And that is to, to come back to the composition of this panel, right? And to think about, maybe thinking in terms of the voluntarism, right, that is predominating in not just intellectual discussions, but in Ukrainians' embodied resistance to imperial domination now, that there's a lot that's ad hoc. There's a lot that is informally organized. To cite Emily Channel Justice's new book, right? It's things that are happening without the state, right? Things that are happening that people are doing for themselves. This group, Decolonizing Eastern European Studies, we've been doing for years. And that it started out as an initiative that was just a group of people who were thinking about epistemology and thinking about the region and the production of knowledge and trying to reflexively analyze the ways in which power-laden relationships conditioned how knowledge evolved, and that has become something. So I guess I would say to all the emerging scholars out there, don't wait for these ideas to be institutionalized. Do it yourself, right? And let things grow and become something, and eventually you will rise to power, right? Thank you to all of the people who asked questions that we did not have time to address. There were a lot of questions. So thanks to everyone for their participation. And thank you so much to Chris and Shoshana and the Davis Center for organizing this terrific series.
And thank you so much, Jessica, for joining us and moderating this important discussion. And thank you to Amanda and Carolina and Maria for your really valuable contributions. I really enjoyed hearing not only about your individual work, but how that helped to make the case about the work that you're doing already, pushing at the boundaries of decolonizing our field. So thank you all. And thanks to everybody for joining us and watching today. We understand that there's a lot of things happening today as we mark the 1-year anniversary of the war. And we're very glad that this will be available to be shared, to be viewed on YouTube after the fact. The next session that we are hosting in this series is coming up next week. We will meet next Friday on March 3rd at 12 p.m. On Zoom and in YouTube for a conversation on decolonization impact beyond the ivory tower. And we will be joined in that conversation by Douglas Rogers, who is professor of anthropology at Yale University, with speakers representing the National Defense University, Voice of America, and the Yale University Library. So please do join us for that. And until that time, we look forward to seeing you, and thanks again.